Okay, welcome to tonight's presentation webinar for AMRR402 session 4. As you know, we are on a very tight time schedule with this module, so I hope it's been going well with you and your research. Have you managed to do the research design chapter 3, and have you started your field research yet? As you will notice, we are on week 4 before the final submission date, so it is fairly important that you are on schedule, that you have finished chapter 3 and that you have started gathering the data, your field research, and maybe even started to analyze some of the results that you've gotten in already for your chapter 4. Tonight we will just briefly look at chapter 3, just a revision to see whether you are comfortable with what you've done in chapter 3, and then move on to how you actually report those results that you are gathering during the field research. As you know very well by this time, I think, that chapters 1 and 2 was building the case for the research, where you did your chapter 1 with the marketing audit and theory in order to actually get to a doable problem statement and research objectives. And then in chapter 2, literature review, you actually read about what other researchers found in their particular studies that is relevant to your particular research. And hopefully you took notes of the questions that were asked by those studies and of the components, the theory that you looked at in chapter 1, and used those to inform your research design, especially the choice of tools and the method, as well as the questions that you used in your tools to gather the data in order to properly find the information that you need to answer your research objectives. So tonight we're looking at chapter 3, reporting the results, and those results per objective should lead logically into your chapter 5, the conclusions, where we then answer the problem statement. So if we do a quick review of chapter 3, if you still have any questions, please ask. So for the research methodology and design, chapter 3, use this as a checklist for yourself. To what extent have you done the introduction to the chapter, and gave a copy of the research objectives that you actually developed in chapter 1. That is very important, since the research objectives are the base for your methodology choices, your choices in tools to use, your choices in sampling approach, etc., etc. We discussed that in depth with the previous session, session 3. Research methodology. The choice is motivated from your research theory, which means I expect to see definitions of qualitative, quantitative, etc. based on the specific objectives that you set for your research in chapter 1, and then said, why is this the most applicable method to use based on those specific objectives and the research theory. Research design, again, motivated from theory, which means that if you choose to use a survey or a focus group or interviews, I expect to see theory that says why is this, what is the pros and cons of using those tools, and why is that most applicable or efficient for you to use in view of your specific objectives. Same with the sample population and sampling approach, based on your objectives motivated from theory. So I want to see the sample population based on your specific research, and then the sampling approach that you are using or going to use to actually do the field research, and why that is the most suitable sampling approach in this regard. Data analysis, again, based on your objectives and your data gathering tools and method that you discussed in 3.2, you will then motivate from theory why are you using those specific methods to analyze the data, and that is, qualitative, quantitative, different approaches to data analysis. You have to discuss everything that you intend using. Technical and quality issues. Have you completed the following? Definitions of reliability, validity, and generalizability. And have you discussed your particular research design in terms of reliability, validity, and to what extent that will enable you to actually generalize to a broader population. Potential bias, where exactly is there areas of potential bias for your study? Limitations at this point when you actually do the field research, the limitations will come forward. I think one of the biggest ones in this regard may be the time, because this semester is really very short. But again, it must be realistic. Don't try and blame everything on limitations. You had the opportunity, to actually plan your study to accommodate these limitations. So be very realistic about that. Ethical issues and confidentiality. Did you take into consideration the ethical issues for your particular research? Have you drawn up a cover letter for the participants where you actually ensure or assure them that this responses will be kept confidential, etc.? And then finally, pilot testing of tools, always recommended, because the wording of the questions in your tools, etc., is very important to make sure that people understand what you expect from them, but also to make sure that you are actually covering sufficient variables in each of your tools, so that the results that you get from those tools are sufficient to answer your particular research objectives. Then, as always, there should be a chapter summary where you give a brief summary of what this chapter covered. And in the appendices, there must be a cover letter for each of the sample groups or tools, if there are different sample groups and tools, as well as a copy of the actual survey or interview questions or document analysis framework, etc., depending on what tools you intend to use. So how are you doing in terms of chapter 3? Have you managed to do all of that? Do you have any questions? And hopefully, have you started already with the field research? Okay. Chapter 3, the methodology. How do you write that particular chapter? First, give the definitions and the theory applicable to the methods you intend using. Motivate your choice of method, of tools, of sampling approaches, etc., based on the theory that you have given. Explain exactly what you intend doing based on the objectives. This is a project plan, chapter 3, and to the extent that you actually both base it on theory and spell out in detail what are you going to do, the better your design and the more likely you are to get the correct results for your study, so that you can actually answer your research objectives and in the end answer your research objectives. Good. Appendices, we've spoken about that before. A cover letter, as we mentioned before, indicating that the study is part of your studies at IMM, and it must state the purpose of the study and indicate that participation is voluntary. That's part of ethics in research. The cover letter must also assure the participants that their answers will be treated as confidential, so you cannot ask their names and all kinds of identifying information that will make them not keen to answer your survey or focus group issues, because then they feel that their confidentiality may be broached. It is also a good idea to actually indicate to them how long the survey will take, and that is where the pilot study will help you. People are not very keen to actually participate in surveys that will take them longer than, say, for instance, 10 minutes. The shorter the better, and the more likely they will be to actually complete this survey for you. And your contact details should be there should they have questions about the research, etc. Survey format and layout. We've looked at several examples in session 3. The survey format and layout must be neat and compact so that it looks easy completable for the person that looks at the survey. Survey questions must be arranged per objective or per theme and show a logical flow. Again, if they understand what the questions are about, they are more likely to answer better, because they understand why you are asking these specific questions. The wording of the questions must be in simple language. Avoid technical and marketing terms because they're not always marketing. They do not always have a marketing degree or whatever. Also, do not use slang. Use proper English so that they understand what you are asking. Only one issue or one variable per question, and you should have used appropriate rating scales with clear instructions on how a respondent should answer it. Yes, no questions does not really serve a purpose. You do not learn much about it. Rather go with something like a rating scale 1 to 5 or some of the other scales that we used, other methods of asking questions. If you are doing interviews, which is quite time intensive, do yourself a favor and send the interview questions to the interviewee before the actual interview. So then the person is on the same page as you are. They're not surprised when you start asking particular questions, and they can actually prepare a couple of examples to share with you, which then enriches the data that you will be getting from them. Your interview schedule, set of questions, should not be more than 8. Because of the fact that this is open-ended discussion questions, and they can actually talk quite a lot per question. So you have to limit the number of questions. Try and understand better why people did certain things, why they took specific decisions, reasons for their preferences and choices. So you are trying to get in-depth understanding. So don't ask, survey type questions in an interview. That is defeating the purpose. Remember that a survey looks at how many people think the same way, while in an interview you try and understand why they actually think that way or took those decisions. And then always ask for examples that will actually illustrate certain issues in the interview. Now for the next step, where we'll actually look at chapter 4, which is reporting your results of the field research. To what extent have you already started with the field research? Are you on schedule? Are you struggling still with chapter 3? There's not much time left, and the field research actually takes some time. So now we look at chapter 4. If you remember your chapter 1, your problem context, problem statement and objectives, and your research design, your chapter 3 was based on the objectives. You used the literature review to actually, with the theory from chapter 1, you used a literature review in chapter 2 to actually find some questions and variables about which to ask questions in your research tools. And if you did it properly, put it into your research design, then it will get you the correct results that will enable you to actually answer your research objectives. And the results from those research objectives, the data that you gathered, will then in turn feed into the chapter 5 conclusions and recommendations, which will help you answer your problem statement. So you can see there is a cyclical route from your research objectives to your chapter 4 results, and from the problem statement to your chapter 5 conclusions. It's like tying up a gift package where you then complete the process and find the answers that you actually identified in chapter 1. So chapter 4 results answer your research objectives, while chapter 5 then answers your problem statement. If you look at the headings for chapter 4, as for every chapter that you have done, you start with the introduction that just sort of recaps what the research is about, and the key the problem statement and the research objectives you can give there again, because you will be reporting the results per objective. Your first section is describing the response rates. Say, for instance, you sent out surveys to 100 people and you only received back 25. I'm looking for the exact figures, but then also convert it to percentages. And if you have asked any demographic information, this is also the section where you actually describe those demographics. Say, for instance, you distinguished between men and women or particular age groups. That is where you actually then look at the responses that you received and say who finally responded, what are their demographics looking like. And then you will start a discussion per objective. Your heading will be the key words of the objective as title for that particular subheading. And then if you have done more than one tool, say for instance you did surveys and interviews, you discuss survey results of that particular objective and the interview results, and you actually compare them and see to what extent there are similarities and differences. And then in the end you have a brief summary for that particular objective, where you discuss the key findings and to what extent the objective has been answered or not. And that is very important, because the key findings that you identify per objective will make it easier for you to actually flow into chapter 5 and then consolidate those to answer your problem statement. So do not neglect the summary of each of the objectives. And then when you've done the one objective, you go on to the next objective. And here you see the reason why it's good to actually have your survey questions sorted by objective, so that when you actually analyze it now, it is easier to talk about the specific results for objective 1, for objective 2, and so on. It just makes it much easier to have it structured that way. And so you go on depending on how many objectives you have for your particular research. And in the end you have the summary of the chapter, again where you say to what extent have you actually answered the various research objectives. And be honest, if you have not really gotten the correct data or sufficient data to answer that particular objective, be honest about it. State that this was, not incomplete or not sufficient, and what was the actual problems about it, because it gives you, the examiner an idea that you understand where the weak spots in your research design was. If you try and just gloss over it, but the examiner can see that this was not properly done, it just says that you are not honest enough about your capabilities in this regard. So let us look at the particular sections, components in the actual chapter 4. First of all, the introduction to the chapter, as always, just a brief overview of the chapter and what it will cover. And then you have the response rate and demographic reporting. And then the discussion of types of data analysis, whether it's quantitative data analysis or qualitative analysis per objective, and your summary. You will be working with the raw data that you've gathered. So, for instance, you've done the survey, you have now, say, a spreadsheet with all of that data in, and you have to keep it on hand in case of queries. But you do not put the actual raw data in chapter 4 or in the appendices, and you don't refer the examiner to the data in the appendices. If you see you're running out of pages and you do that, the examiner is not going to be impressed. Remember, the only material that will be marked in the appendices are your cover letters and the actual copies of the tools that you are using. It is your responsibility to convert the raw data into proper results. Sort it, structure it, add value through discussion in Chapter 4. Don't leave it for the examiner to do. The examiner knows how to do it. The examiner wants to see if you can do it. Okay, if you leave it for the examiner to do, guess what? Data versus information versus knowledge. Data is the raw facts that describe particular phenomenon, whether it's in your survey and whether it's the results from a focus group or interviews. That is a raw data that you've got there. If you've now sorted it into a specific context, that becomes information. So it has a particular meaning within that specific context. And knowledge then refers to your value adding to those that information, where you actually add the context, your understanding of the specific research problem as you identified it in Chapter 1, and then discuss it and reflect upon what these data information is telling you about the specific objective and about the specific marketing problem that you identified initially. So, from the raw data, you have to organize and structure the data, which gives you information. Say, for instance, you are reflecting that information in terms of bar charts or pie charts. You then have to explain and interpret, add meaning to that particular chart, so that it becomes knowledge. Just repeating the statistics is not what we want. We want you to take it a step further. Okay. Say, for instance, your response rate was 25 from 100 surveys sent out. You give the number of the original survey sent out and the number that responded, and put that as a percentage. Same with interviews or focus groups, doesn't matter. So your plan was one thing in Chapter 3, the actual response rate is now in Chapter 4, where you say, okay, this is what actually happened. Demographics, how many men, women, number, and percentage. How many from each level if you actually had a stratified group in the company. Provide graphs and give a proper discussion. See the following example. Say, for instance, here 500 surveys were distributed to two private schools in the Johannesburg area to parents of children between the ages of 2 to 6. Of the 500 surveys distributed, only 120 were returned, therefore indicating a 24% response rate. However, only 105 surveys were considered usable for the study due to the fact that 10 of the unusual surveys were either blank or only partially completed. So you can see how you discuss what you actually received back from your research, field research, and why only part of that was usable for the research. For instance, very important, if you had screening questions, you were looking for parents of children between that particular ages. And they were not parents or guardians of those aged children, that would not be suitable population for your specific study. Again, if you actually asked age ranges, you can look at that particular graph that gives you the age groups, and that actually then tells you which of the groups were the largest group of respondents, and you should then compare it to the actual population spread out there. Say for instance you are working in a company and you are getting this result from the age question. You have to go to HR and find out if this is representative of the employees in the company. Are there really 45% of people aged between 25 and 34? If not, you have to acknowledge the fact that the respondents do not properly reflect the population in the company as given. So in that regard, you don't just give the figures. You actually have to say to what extent this is representative of your population group. Where appropriate, give trends and frequencies in the forms of pie charts, graphs, or bar charts. But the cherry on top, the value added, will be when you begin to understand what those trends and patterns are showing you in terms of the objective and in terms of the topic. That means that you may have to go back to the particular question for those results so that you can put that result into context with the question and how it was asked and what exactly it asked, and then relate it back to the objective that you gathered that particular data for. That insight that you are generating through this discussion and reflection is what you will compare in your chapter 5 with what you found in literature. How does this compare to what other similar studies found? And it helps you provide valid conclusions and help you give practical recommendations in chapter 5. Okay, analyzing quantitative data. There are two main approaches to that: descriptive methods and inferential methods. Descriptive, you have the numerical summaries, frequency analysis, and you depict it into graphs. Inferential methods, which may have been a bit difficult for this tight time frame. There you have hypotheses, and you actually do the statistical tests of confidence intervals and significance tests, etc., etc., so that you have that data. Inferential methods require a larger data response, a sample size. Descriptive methods not so sensitive to the sample size. In both cases, even if you give the graphs and the frequency analysis or the confidence intervals and the significance, you still have to discuss the actual findings in relation to the question, in relation to the objective that you are looking at, or hypothesis in this case. Descriptive statistics are used to describe the basic features of the data in a study, simple summaries about the sample and the measures, basically using frequency analysis together with simple graphic analysis. They form the base of a lot of quantitative analysis of data, unless you are going into your master's and doctoral degrees. Descriptive statistics is fine. Within the inferential statistics, you need somebody that is very strong in statistics that can assist you with actually choosing the correct tests and actually doing the tests and analyzing the results from those tests, so that you do not fall into traps in terms of the statistical terminology and what those tests mean. Okay. quantitative analysis, when you do inferential statistics, you will be setting hypotheses. Now, I'm sure that you have done this in your theory, research theory previously, where you actually then set a null and an alternative hypothesis. You set the significance level, say whether it's a one or two-tailed prediction, whether the distribution of the results is normal or whether it's skewed to one side, appropriate statistical tests, and then in the end you look at the output from those tests and you reject or fail to reject the null hypothesis. Hypothesis is, the null hypothesis is basically your devil's advocate position, where you are undertaking, say for instance, undertaking classes have no effect on performance. This is your devil's advocate. And then the alternative hypothesis, it has a positive effect on student performance. Very simple example. But then you need the large sample and you need the correct tests to actually then test these hypotheses. So for instance, you do a t-test with a 2-sample, assuming unequal variances for specifically low-cost products in a bank. There you see the test, and then you see the null hypothesis standalone product offering average probability versus your bundled products average probability, and you see how the student rejects the null hypothesis in favor of the alternative hypothesis. Okay, but now you have this result and you have to discuss it. So in terms of that particular answer then, you have this discussion here, and you see that the person has discussed the cost of the standalone products is very consistent, the swing in profitability, but the same cannot be said in terms of the bundled product, etc., etc. So you see, it's not just left with the statistics from the statistical tests results. You have to actually explain it in terms of the question and in terms of the objective for the study. Now, if we look at the descriptive statistics, the simpler version of actually looking at your results. Say, for instance, you did surveys with the Likert scale. There you do the frequency analysis, how many marked a 1, 2, 3, or 4 on the scale, and that indicates trends, overall more positive or negative, or even spread across those. And you use those frequencies to draw up a bar chart, pie chart, whatever you decide to do. But then again, that is only the start. Now you have to discuss these results. You look at the actual wording of the question. Please don't do the mean and the mode and all that stuff. It actually takes away from the nuances of the results. Leave it as is if you have there, and then look at the wording of the questions as well as the topic or the specific objective that these specific questions spoke to. And then reflect on what those trends are saying overall about, for instance, the consumer perception regarding service or whatever. And if you see a very funny spread, for instance, a lot of uncertainty or neutrals, you have to ask the question why. Why are people not positive or negative? Why are they sort of centered in the middle of that particular scale? So If you see a clear trend, I would summate the positive responses and negative responses. Oh, I've got two positives there. One should be negative and one should be positive. Sorry. And say, for instance, you've got a large group that is actually in the not sure category. That opens a question that says, why? Why are there so many people not sure? In this case, it talks about they have a knowledge management program. Now you've got the negatives here, and the negatives is fairly low, 16.7%. The positives are fairly high, 50%. But now look at the number of not sures, and the question is, was this program, this ability to document high-level plans and goals not communicated properly? Do all people not have access to that? So that is the type of questions you would ask if you see such a high neutral frequency there. Again, this is a very funny graph. You can see a very even spread, and again, depending on the specific question, in this case customer satisfaction, you have to think why, and this is where the context and the original marketing problem that you identified in chapter 1 comes up. It says, why do I have such an even spread across all of these, the dissatisfied, satisfied, and neutrals? Please note that all the graphs and tables have numbers and titles. Because it is data coming from your field research, you don't have a source like you have for theoretical models, etc. But these figures and tables must be listed in your list of tables and figures, which comes just after your table of content. Example of a discussion. Again, this is a question that actually the extent to which sales representatives understand what their customers regard as important. So there you see a more realistic spread, always, rarely, fairly many times, most of the time. And you have the discussion that says a positive response and serves as evidence that there's a general understanding amongst the sample of sales reps of what the customer regards as important when they analyze data. This links strongly to the results of question 12. So you can see how this person actually cross-referenced the variance results between surveys and between interviews, contrary to the interview's perception that there's a general lack of understanding. So you can see these issues, the contrast between different questions and different population groups and different tools, is where you actually pick up the eureka moment and say, this is very important, I need to pay attention to this. So, for instance, you put multiple questions on one graph. Here you can see this is client loyalty results, but you've got different questions there, and you've got two population groups there. So you've got question 10, 11, and 12, but there's two groups, C group and the P group, okay? And every time you can actually compare the two on the same question. But to make it easier for the examiner, please give a little brief description of the question wording in each case. Otherwise, the examiner must page backward and forward to the actual copy of the survey. And if the examiner is tired or late at night or under pressure to mark a lot of paper, they don't want to do that. So give just the keywords there so that one can see what these specific questions deal with. Also try not to put more than, say for instance, 4 questions on the same graph, because otherwise the graph gets too small, too busy, too compact to actually properly see the trends emanating from that particular data. So you see the question numbers and the brief title per question for each of the sets of results. Multiple questions on one graph, it still remains imperative that you actually discuss each of those questions. The fact that they're together on one graph doesn't mean that you don't have to discuss that. Okay? Do not repeat the numbers or percentages. That is not a discussion. Question 10, say for instance, indicates that there's much uncertainty in the organization in regards to whether its clients have a greater cross-sell potential than the competition, and so on and so on. So then you can actually then come to some conclusions in that particular objective. When we get to qualitative data analysis, say for focus groups or for interview responses, read the transcribed responses very well, together with your own notes. Highlight key issues and words and put it into a framework such as the one that we will show on the next slide. Then compare the responses with each other, but also note the frequency of similar responses or differences in responses. Say for instance, I've got questions 1 to 6, I've got 3 interviewees. I actually, when I analyze the data, I can put the key themes and key words and thoughts for question 1 in this matrix, and then I can compare them. If there are similarities, differences, or if there is even a new theme coming through. And so you do it for each of the questions, and if necessary, you actually have space for additional themes that's coming out. And you look at how many of them actually agree with each other and how many of them disagree. So it's not sufficient just to list the responses from interviews or from focus group. You have to go very carefully through the data. Look at the frequency, the different issues, new themes, overall trends. What is it indicating about the question or the objective or topic? Then critically discuss the answers in relation to other tools. We've seen that before, where you discuss the results from interviews with the results from surveys and say, but there's a difference. Say, for instance, you interviewed management, but you actually surveyed your customers. And if there's a major difference in between what they actually think about service quality, for instance, that is a key feature that you need to acknowledge, so that when you do the recommendations in chapter 5, that you actually can pick up on that and say, what exactly, how exactly are we communicating and how well do we actually understand our customer base. Say for instance, this is a qualitative discussion example. 2 of the financial intermediaries and 3 distribution heads were interviewed, and they suggest that the gap between the customer, what the customer needs and what the account managers delivered has increased. So there's a gap between what management and these account managers think and versus what the customer wants. As one respondent put it, so you can actually give brief quotes, and please don't give the names of your respondents unless you have in writing permission to do that. Otherwise, you just name, say, A, B, C, D, or 1, 2, 3, 4. You can then keep the confidentiality in that manner. So you have the brief quote there from a particular respondent, and then you can see that there is a problem where the account managers used to be skilled and having the right capabilities, but they are becoming redundant on the top end of your financial intermediary market. So that is very important, that the person picked up this discrepancy. So again, if we actually analyze it, note the frequency analysis of responses. 2 financial intermediaries, 3 distribution heads. So you know it's 5 people that actually agreed on the fact that there's a gap between what the customer wants and what the account managers. And then note the use of a short quote to illustrate a point, and note the additional theme or issue coming from the discussion, where they're actually saying that some skills and knowledge is becoming redundant in that particular marketplace. That is very important. That is adding value to the actual discussion of the results. Remember, you have to discuss the results per objective. And at the end of the results for a particular objective, you need to give a short summary indicating the key issues from that objective and to what extent the research objective was answered. If you have read in your literature review any studies with similar focus on the issues, you can now then say, you know, my results are similar or different to what was found in the study of so-and-so. You don't repeat your literature review, you just say it's similar or different from a particular other study. Let's look at the discussion of results per objective. Say, for instance, a survey results from objective 1, the placement of advertisements. You can see the questions there, and when they are actually saying there, 72.5% say they are not influenced by comments on social sites. Please do not just repeat the percentages, but in this particular case, you will see it serves a purpose. If you look at the graphs there, they view the ads, they say cancel the ads, they notice the ads, they say there's too many ads. So even if the participants agree that there are too many advertisements on television, they still view or notice these advertisements. An interesting point, you see that this person really looked at the results and thought about it. That the participants were asked if the advertisements should be cancelled, 65% of them said no. So you've got this disassociation where they say there's too many advertisements, but they don't want you to cancel the advertisements. So there is that conflicting view. So that is your point of interest. Why do you see this pattern? As seen in the figure above, even the participants agree there are too many advertisements. They still view or notice it. Interesting point. That is your interesting point that you pick up there. But that means you really have to look at what these trends are saying to you about specific questions. And if there is a contradiction in terms, you need to highlight that, because that is the value that you actually get from the analysis. Summary of objective 1. The findings are interesting, as one would think that viewers would take feedback or comments to show into consideration of what to watch, but they do not consider that as important. It is similar to the view that Brennan had with a multitude of alternatives of video that is available. They still prefer the TV when they go to other sources. So there you see how you actually compare your results to valid or similar studies on the same issues. The interview of media is what we need to do, etc., etc., etc. Okay? I hope this is helping you. Okay, at the end of the discussion per objectives, you will have a summary of the chapter. To what extent do the findings answer your various research objectives? Remember that your results are valuable even if they differ from what you expected, or if the answer to your objectives will be no instead of yes, or maybe in part. It doesn't matter. You have learned something that you did not know before. Maybe you made some assumptions when you set these objectives and you anticipated some results and it turned out differently, and that is fine. You just acknowledge it and you say to what have you now learned from this results from the field research. So what you need to do for our next session is you need to finish your chapter 4. At this point you should be busy with your field research, and if you are really on schedule you should be starting to analyze your data and writing up your chapter 5. Then you can actually start your chapter 5 so that when we discuss it next time, which is just before a couple of days before the actual submission date, then you can ask any questions or any problems that you have in this regard, and we can discuss the chapter 5. Okay, any questions from your side? How are you doing? How far are you with your actual results? With your field research? Have you started the field research yet? Any responses? Any questions you have? Please, this is now your opportunity to ask what you are still struggling with, what that issues you are not sure about. Did this help? Does it help you in your field research and your data analysis and your writing up of the results? Walter, how is your research going? Good, I'm very glad to hear that, Walter. I will see you on Saturday and we can discuss it even more. Good. If you're already collecting the data, it's good news. Colleen, Kyle, Lindiwe, Rufiwa, how are you going with your research? I see you busy typing. I'll wait for you. Yes, I know focus group dynamics are hard. I hope you have an extra person that can help you with the group dynamics and somebody that will be capturing the data. Colleen, good. Sounds good. If you're collecting the data, I hope you manage to get the data so that you can actually start analyzing and writing it up, because that takes time, sort of analyzing it and then writing it up in the way that it should be done. Okay, it sounds good. Lindy, Kyle, I haven't heard from you. How is it going? Oh, I saw. Okay. Lindy, sorry, I see now that you were one of the respondents. Kyle? Okay. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. I hope you are attending classes as well. This Saturday I have the class in Johannesburg, and I hope to see some of you there, because time is really getting short. Thank you for attending. Thank you for sharing the time with me and your progress. Good luck. There's light in front of the tunnel, and if you're already gathering data, that tunnel is not, that light is not the train. You're doing good. Good night. Keep well.